good morning and welcome to this week's halftime talk. We're very, very privileged to have Mr. Amos Hochstein joining us from Washington, D.C., where he was formerly senior energy advisor in the Obama administration and is now a senior vice president at Tellurian. Amos, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. I'm really grateful to be able to join you remotely and virtually.
Thank you. There's a lot of things to touch on that we're dealing with in this current sort of period of time, no doubt. One of the things I want to just sort of start with is energy policy out of the US, energy policy of the US and how it intersects with geopolitics. We've seen the recent developments with the OPEC Plus agreement where Russia and Saudi Arabia first appeared to be in a divorce, then Trump seemed to influence to get them back together, and now we're on this big, massive oil supply cut journey that has a review this week where the deeper cuts might be implemented. My question to you ultimately is this a tripartite US, Russia, Saudi management of the international oil markets? From your perspective, what is that relationship?
So I think that's a great question. And the base answer, I think, that is no, it is not a tripartite agreement. However, we're in an unprecedented territory in the oil market controls from two perspectives. One, as you said, the cuts that we've seen from Saudi and Russia and the rest of OPEC are really extraordinary in their volume. And the second is this political involvement from the United States. When we talk about a tripartite, that would mean that there are three entities that are controlling supply into the market. Russia and Saudi are able to do that from the political level down to the wellhead. That is not the case in the United States. The U.S. can do something that it's never done before, and that is openly and publicly intervene in order to encourage an outcome in Russia and the rest of OPEC. But it does not mean that the political pressure from the United States translates into the production side in the United States. And here is where, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, because I say that it's the first time that the United States has done so publicly. But it's clearly not the first time that the United States, and at the level of the president of the United States, has intervened, encouraging OPEC members to produce or to cut production. It normally, though, comes from the other end. It normally happens when oil prices rise to such a degree that it threatens economic growth in certain countries, including the United States. When I was in the Obama administration, the Libya crisis happened very suddenly. 1.5 million barrels a day of production went offline, and that affected prices that were already at the $100 level, and they rose significantly. And there was an intervention from the United States behind the scenes to make sure, or a request, that OPEC and Saudi in particular increase production in order to ease that, so that this would cause less pressure on U.S. economic growth, and at that point declining growth as a result of it, and fears of a renewed recession back in 2011. So we are in this, yeah. Please.
I was just going to say that I think the unique moment here, which you just touched on, is that this tripartite stool, if you like, that my thesis is built on, is that on this occasion, Russia, Saudi, and the US wants higher oil prices, which is kind of an unprecedented posture from a US administration. And it is a unique moment in which it is in all of their three interests to do so, because of the scale of the US energy industry. And in an election year, perhaps, that's quite important to Donald Trump.
So I agree. That is exactly what's so remarkable about this set of circumstances. We have, for the first time, the United States, I would say it differently. The United States traditionally has certain political axioms. Every president facing re-election does not wants to see as low as possible gasoline prices. That is an axiom. And we've essentially done the opposite. We've had a president who's asked foreign countries to create an environment in which gasoline prices will go up. Now, that is because the destruction of the economy in the United States due to COVID was suffering as a result of with low job numbers, and the oil industry was suffering along with it. And therefore, the idea of destroying the oil patch coming into the election was very difficult. There was another motive here, and that is that this is a constituency and an issue that President Trump has been very forceful on throughout his campaign for president and his 3 years as president. I am supporting the oil industry. I want energy independence, energy dominance, and so on. And those arguments would be at risk if we started seeing significant bankruptcies and increased financial, which we're seeing, financial destruction in the oil industry. So we saw WTI going negative and so on. So but I believe this is a temporary alliance, because we are walking into a conflict that we are seemingly cannot avoid. As a result of these unprecedented declines in production, we also saw a remarkable rally in oil prices, and even having some financial houses starting to say we're going to see $50 by the end of this calendar year. If we see prices sustained above $40 and towards $50, U.S. producers are going to produce. They are already begun increasing production. So we are seeing the declines continue in some basins, and some basins in the United States already seeing a recovery, not to where they were, but some rigs coming back and activity. If prices are sustained towards $50, you could see a significant increase and a natural conflict emerging where Russia, Saudi, other OPEC members will be faced with a dilemma. The United States wanted us to get to this agreement to reduce production, but we took some pain with these lower prices and lower production numbers. And now the United States producers are going to come and take the benefits. They're going to take market share again.
Well, that might be part of the big grand bargain between Donald and MBS. And before we go into that, perhaps I'd welcome your thoughts on the election year that it is, and this concept of energy independence, which has become sort of like a US holy grail of sorts, whether it's fallacy or not, but ultimately it's become relatively real in the sense that we did get up to 13 whatever million barrels of oil a day, lots of gas, and exporting LNG and oil and so on, and that now energy independence concept aspiration is drifting away as shale collapses, and forecast that we might drop below 10 million barrels a day in US production. My question to you on that is, surveys in Texas say we're more fearful of a Democratic president than a Republican president in terms of energy policy and the reclaiming of the energy independence aspiration. From your perspective, serving obviously in the Obama Democratic administration, is that a justified concern by the oil industry, the energy industry in Texas, or will the Democratic government also be aspiring to reclaim the holy grail of energy independence?
So I think you get stuck into definitions. I usually tell people in elections, there's a lot more bluster about change than will actually come when it comes to big issues of foreign policy, national security, energy policy. They tend to be big topics during campaigns and rather seamless transitions. We are not in that environment now. We will see a big transition in energy policy from the United States if Joe Biden becomes the president of the United States. And I was privileged enough to work very closely with him for several years and visited the Gulf with him. We are going to see a change. So I will answer your question about whether that should be a fear for Texas or not. I don't think so. I don't think it's a fear. I think we have to start understanding that there is, first of all, there's no such thing as energy independence. There wasn't during the Obama administration, and there isn't any today. We are living in a global world, dealing with global commodities. And the idea that the more we produce, the more independent we are, is not only a fallacy, but it's a dangerous set of expectations that you can't live up to. Because what we've seen now with COVID is that a set of circumstances anywhere around the world will impact our ability to produce and our ability to be dominant and to be independent. And that is true on both the decline side as well as the upward pressure as well. Events around the world anywhere will have effects everywhere. So we are today facing with a low price. If we go to higher prices because of an incident overseas, that will affect American prices as well. We are interconnected no matter how much we produce. Second, Texas and other basins are right that there will be a change. But what is that change? The change will be that we will have more restrictions on emissions. The cost of the barrel may go up because we will not allow flaring, perhaps, I hope. And we will require all kinds of safeguards to look at how to control the footprint of the oil and gas industry. At the same time, when you talk about energy independent and energy self-sufficiency and energy dominant, we can no longer think of the word energy as oil and gas. And the renewable sector, and I would separate renewables and clean tech. These are two industries that are part of the energy industry. You asked me, should Texas be worried? And I think people around the world would be shocked to find out that Texas, Houston, is the leading state and city in the United States for wind energy. So Texas is not just oil and gas anymore. It is also renewable power, because at the end of the day, Texas is very good for energy. And the regulatory environment in Texas that was good for oil and gas is good for renewables as well. So I think what we're going to see in a Democratic administration is a huge departure for where we are now. Number one, you're going to see a reimposition of the regulations from the Obama administration that were taken out by the Trump administration. I believe we're going to see some very difficult and strict regulations on flaring, which in the United States have grown in Texas and elsewhere as a result of the shale oil and gas really being burned. That's both a waste of money and terrible for the economy. We're going to continue to see more money spent on energy infrastructure for renewables. And so there'll be that shift. And I think what you'll see is oil and gas companies will adapt. I think one of the most remarkable things—
already adapting, you would say, because they're seeing the economic opportunity of clean tech.
I think oil and gas companies are some of the most nimble, and as much as they are behemoths and they're huge companies, at the end of the day, they see themselves as energy companies, not as oil and gas companies.
Right.
And they make the investments to shift. I think the American companies are laggards because of bad policy in the United States that's masking where the industry is, the headwinds that the industry is facing. We need to understand and internalize in the American oil and gas industry that the way I would see it as for oil, we are short-term bullish and long-term bearish. On gas, I am short-term bearish and long-term bullish. And regulations and posture by the Trump administration is creating a false sense of security that nothing's going to change. It is, not only is it going to change, it's already changing. And this split between energy companies, oil and gas majors in Europe that are transforming themselves quickly, and BP is I think the most remarkable
the last few
example
months
of that.
by Mr. Looney has been quite, just yesterday,
Yep.
setting up some very transformative policies. I think it's also
And
important for
Equinor.
and Equinor, absolutely. The European companies have demonstrated, it would appear, a willingness to think beyond the parameters of what legislation demands of them. You know, the US, we do what is the law and we don't do anything less and we don't do anything more. Whereas the European have taken a more holistic view of their responsibility in society, as well as stakeholder group being much wider. I mean, the industry in Texas and the US, I suppose, would also have to take note that under Obama's administration, the shale industry blossomed. I mean, that was its period of emergence and growth. And you would imagine that circumstance can continue if the economics are right.
I think they can, but I don't think that we're going to see the same kind of growth, because in the Obama administration, we were managing two policies at the same time. One was remember that I guess Joe Biden will be facing the same thing, but Barack Obama came into office during an economic meltdown and a double-digit unemployment, and had to get that car out of the ditch from the moment he came into office in 2009. The shale industry actually helped, and it was a driving force for the economy to come out of that ditch. It created 1 million jobs in places that were not anticipated. So we had population movements to the Dakotas and elsewhere, and it created a real boom industry that not only supported the economic growth in the United States, but also, and the jobs growth, but also put the United States on the map as an exporter of LNG, and really brought the United States into the energy markets like never before. We will now see something again. If Vice President Biden should win the presidency, he'll come in with a troubled economy. So the first action will not be to destroy anything. It will be to encourage the growth of industries. But I come back to this. The United States policy towards energy will change dramatically if Joe Biden is elected president. And I believe Democrats will at the very least control one house of Congress, if not both. And that will lead to dramatic change. And go ahead.
Finish your point.
No, just to finish this one thought. Oil companies in the US are going to have to adapt. And I think that they should have adapted sooner, but they're living under this false sense of this false narrative from the Trump administration that tells them, that's lulling them into a sense that the world that's changing outside the United States is not going to change inside. That ship has sailed. The peak demand for oil is an argument we can have of when, but no longer of if. And therefore, there'll have to be a transition. The American majors will have to start making the acquisitions into clean tech and renewables that their European and Asian counterparts have already done. And this will be the best benefit that a Biden presidency will do to these companies. It will save them in the long term, because if they stay in this posture now of thinking that we are not in an energy transition already, then they will not survive.
On the other point and change that perhaps will come is the relationship with the Gulf, where we're sitting, and what will be the change. And I would welcome your thoughts on how you currently assess the U.S. geopolitical energy policy in the Gulf, sanction Iran, friendly with Saudi, and all of the pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. How does it look to you at the moment, and how do you think it could change if there was to be a change in leadership in the U.S.?
So I think changes are coming. And I believe the Gulf is a very adaptable region and has been led rather remarkably ably by its leaders for the most part over the last several decades of relationships with the United States, swinging from very different presidents, from Ford to and then Carter to Reagan and Clinton and so on. I think that we have some obvious changes. We are going to change the posture towards Iran because the administration that will come in under Vice President Biden will want to ensure that Iran's nuclear weapons program is mothballed again, and that there's no chance that it returns, and will want to take war or military action as the solution for that, to be a last resort, and therefore will want to renegotiate a re-entry into the JCPOA. Clearly, you can't simply sign the JCPOA again. It's virtually signed. I don't really mean it, but rejoining it is not an option. 4 years, you can't ignore the fact that 4 years have passed, issues have come up, and they'll perhaps will have to have a different sunset provision that delays things into the future, and perhaps other issues on terrorism and missile technology will have to be addressed. That will happen. The question becomes, how does that shape the relationship between the United States and UAE and Saudi? And we'll have to see how that transition goes. But I believe the administration will come in wanting to have a good relationship with UAE, a good relationship with the Gulf, and to figure out how to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I don't know that anybody knows how that will work, because there are some things that will have to be worked out, that a Democratic administration will face challenges from its own constituencies and its own feelings about how to build that relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's the most difficult piece.
I mean, it's hard to even assess where that relationship is right now. Clearly, there is something personal relationship between the leadership of the kingdom and Donald Trump's family, but it's hard to say that that is actually government to government, institution to institution. What is the policy and relationship at the moment?
I think you're right. It's a head scratcher. And I think that's why we've seen, it's also very opaque. And so that carries with it, the rest of the relationship has become opaque. But the idea that the United States will leave the region, I think really is not realistic. This is a region that you don't get to leave. We have bases throughout the region, and when you try to leave it, it soon flares up somewhere and reminds you that you have to be back.
We're all interconnected.
Exactly, and it comes to bite you if you try to leave hastily or not too strategically. But I think that if you think of the Obama administration's first 4 years, when we discussed a lot the pivot to Asia, I think we're going to be going back to that. I think there's no doubt that there's this sense that to deal with China is not just about confrontation. It's about how do you disagree with China on some issues and agree with China on issues in the way that Obama did, or tried to do, I think, with mixed results. But China joined the Paris Agreement, but we did not do as well on some other areas. So
that is one of the big changes in the region here, and maybe elsewhere, obviously as well, is that China has more or less arrived in the Gulf, is a player now. They're building, testing centers for COVID in Abu Dhabi. They're doing all sorts of soft power, and we're kind of, whether we're sort of sleepwalking or not, we're into an era in which increasingly there's this Cold War choice we have to make. HSBC have been caught in this choice about what is the national security law in Hong Kong, the situation recently in Israel. There was a water plant choosing not to go with the Chinese company, and so there's this Huawei, the Huawei kind of new technology about the bandwidth issue. So there's this choice. You're with us or you're against us is creeping into the narrative in the Gulf as well. How do you think that plays into an extra challenge that wasn't there when you were previously in an administration?
I think it was building then, and it's accelerated remarkably now. I think the Chinese are no longer willing to accept that they are relegated to sitting in Asia and watching. And I think, to add to your list, the United States used to be the main customer, and that built for the region, and that built a lot of the foundation of the relationship 60, 70 years ago. China is the biggest customer, and you have to be careful of insulting your customer. And so there is a dynamic for the Gulf that they have to realize, and that we in the United States are going to have to understand that there are limits to what we can ask our friends and allies to do that are against their own interests. However, I still believe that most countries, including in the Gulf, when they walk into a relationship with China, they walk with their eyes wide open, and they understand the challenges without being asked to choose, are you with us or against us? They know the Chinese model in Africa that was essentially the testing grounds for soft power and economic power, and that was building stadiums and bridges and roads and providing loans and taking over debts. And then after that came the heavy hand of what they wanted, the control. And I hear from my former counterparties in the region consistently of saying publicly it's a very different line of wanting to work with the Chinese and not wanting to choose, but also privately they are very concerned about these things, these issues. And nobody in the Gulf believes that if there's a flare-up again, planned or foreseen or unforeseen, that the Chinese will come in any way to try to support it and help it. And at the end of the day, the countries in the Gulf are very sensitive to their own control and their own stability in this region. And they've had some tests, even recently. The Qatar relationship with UAE and Saudi is very difficult, and it could have gone in a very different direction without some control. And nobody believes the Chinese will come in that way. So the idea of a relationship with the United States. But I think that there's one other issue that the Gulf is going to have to deal with, and that is, earlier we talked about how will Texas handle an energy transition. I actually think, and John, you're sitting right in a country that probably thought about it ahead of anybody else. How do you think about the energy transition when you are an energy country, when you're an oil producing country? And on the one hand, it's to take care of your biggest customer in China, and that won't change. But I think it's also the transformation that's necessary and required to support the future generations. And I think as far as oil producing countries, nobody's done it better than the UAE. I think even MBS has talked about it as far as how do you make some of these transformations and how do you make investments and use the capital that you have and the resources that you have in order to get in there. And so these are going to shape the region as well. And we saw that start during the Paris Accords or right after the Paris Accords, when both Saudi and UAE and others figured out that the world was changing and tried to adapt with it. I think the last couple of years has been somewhat of a decline in that. But I think that that's going to be a big part of the relationship between the United States and the region. That's going to be a relationship about the future. And I think the China relationship will be about a careful diplomatic dance of dealing with my current customer.
Well, that seems like a sensible place to conclude our conversation, Amos. As always, we could probably rattle on all of these issues, and hopefully we will get many opportunities to do so between now and the election and all of the new world in 2021. But until then, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on Halftime Talk this week, and we wish you well and wish you and your family safe health at this difficult time for everybody. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in person as soon as we all can.